point sources, particularly hand pumps, particularly among the rural poor. And we have not been very good at coming up with ways to facilitate sustainability for them. I would say that we've done very little to create a demand for sustainability. I'm not talking about demand for water. I'm talking about a demand for sustainability. And we've certainly done very little to create a supply of sustainability, a supply of services that means that those are sustainable. And I think we've created this thing that I call the disposable hand pump. Somebody goes in, they install a hand pump, and it only lasts until its first, second, third breakdown, and then it's no use to us anymore. Now I thought I'd change tack a little and talk about what's happening in sanitation. You thought I'd forgotten sanitation, didn't you? You were looking forward to criticizing me for not having covered sanitation. I think what's happening in sanitation is completely different from what's happening in water supply. For one thing, the focus is still very much on the unserved, because there are far more people without sanitation than there are without water supply. And if we look at these regional ladders here, what we see dominates is open defecation. So this is the equivalent of the people who are using surface water in the other charts, but it makes up a big proportion of the people in the world. And in a place like South Asia, we've still got about almost half the population practicing open defecation. But the discourse, and that's sub-Saharan Africa, still large numbers using open defecation. But the discourse in sanitation is completely different. For those of you working in the sanitation sector, there's all kinds of jumping up and down and yelling going on. People have been triggered to make their communities open defecation free. They're all making community action plans and community monitoring plans. And sure enough, communities all over the world are declaring themselves open defecation free. And we're actually slowly starting to see it come up in the data. Open defecation is actually declining quite a bit, and this is only going up to 2008, and we fully expect that we're going to see some pretty dramatic declines. And any of you who are working in the field know that things like community-led total sanitation is taking off like wildfire. And many countries have achieved impressive reductions in open defecation across all wealth quintiles. If you look, for instance, at Bangladesh and Uganda, what you see is, unlike what we saw with the wealth quintile analysis for water for India, that you've got big change going on across the board. There are other countries, India here, you can see that it's quite similar in terms of its sanitation profile, that are really struggling to get change in sanitation happening in the lowest wealth quintiles. But the tide is turning. We're now more and more talking about changing social norms towards sanitation. So like I say, the discourse is completely different in sanitation. So then I thought I'd talk a little bit about the sort of sustainability categories for sanitation. And these are the four I came up with. They're a little bit similar to the four in water supply. And I went back to the statistics people and I asked them for the same kind of data that I had before, and they said no. Because at that time I really had pestered them quite a lot, and they said they'd given me as much data as I was going to get out of them. But to give them credit, the other reason that they said no was that these data are much more complicated. The sanitation categories are not nearly as tidy across different countries. So they didn't say completely no, they just said it would take them 2 days. But seeing it was a day before I left to come to this conference, it was a bit late by then. So we sat down and we did some highly scientific estimates. And I think you will agree with these estimates. Urban network sanitation, sewers, well, some. Urban on-site, quite a bit. Rural networks, forget it, hardly any. How many small towns have network sewers? And rural on-site, a lot, a big lot. What this tells us basically is that when we look at the sanitation sector, sanitation is still very much a household financed and maintained issue. So our sustainability context for sanitation is quite a bit different. But like I said, also the discourse is quite a bit different in sanitation. So this is where I venture beyond what my remit was for making this presentation, beyond just talking about what is the problem, and actually to try your patience a bit by suggesting what some of the things that I think we can learn from this. What do I think we can learn from the data? I think we can learn that 3.3 billion people use network water supply, and there's a particular sustainability issue there, but I think we are sort of well on our way to addressing that through a lot of the work that's going on with utility reform and local government strengthening in terms of municipal services. But 1.3 billion, largely poor and rural, still use point sources, and we are very far from having good models for sustainability of those. And sanitation remains largely an on-site household matter. What can we learn from our failures? And I'm going to be very brave here and quite provocative and say community management doesn't work. I put this into my presentation and then looked at the agenda and saw that there's a whole session on community management. So whoever I have just mortally offended, I'm very sorry. But I have a feeling that what we're talking about in the sessions on community management is on the fact that the models that we've got have not worked very well, and we need to have better models for helping communities to manage. 5? Okay, I'm good. I think one of the problems that we've got is that the least capacitated people have been given the greatest burden of sustainability. So we take poor and remote communities, and by asking them to maintain these point sources, we are expecting them to manage a supply chain for spare parts, keep trained personnel available all the time, and to manage sometimes a complicated system of collecting and keeping revenue. And that's a lot to ask for a poor community. Too many of the point source systems are off budget, off plan, and not in line with policy. Very many of these disposable hand pumps are being installed by agencies who are not particularly interested in working with government, who find government clumsy and difficult to work with, which is true, many times they are, but then become impatient and just go in and install hand pumps. And then we end up with a system where it's very difficult to get local government to take any responsibility for them because they weren't responsible for the selection of the hand pumps or the choice of how the system was set up. And also that the private sector in rural water supply is underutilized. We haven't done enough with the private sector, and we leave a lot of the capacity of the private sector sitting on the table. What can we learn from what has happened in the urban sector, in urban utility reform? And my first 3 points here have to do with how you deal with people. And I think that the good utilities that have been successful in reforming, have learned that you treat users not as beneficiaries but as customers. You give them a voice and you're accountable to them. You make sure that your customers have a recourse mechanism whereby if they don't like the service you're providing, they have a number they can phone or somebody they can write to. If you give people good service, they will pay. This has been one of the basic premises of reforming utility service. And that reliability is key to user satisfaction. That really what utilities need to do is to be able to ensure that when people turn on the taps, water comes out. And of course, this is something that we have not emphasized enough when it comes to rural water supply, that when somebody walks all that distance, that 30 minutes to get to the pump, that there actually is water there. The other thing I think good utilities, reformed utilities have learned is if you get the incentives right, operators will perform well. And that this is true whether you're dealing with private sector participation in the sector or whether you're dealing with public sector agencies, that incentives are key. And that scale provides opportunities. A big utility, a small utility, you take advantage of the fact that that one utility, if you strengthen it, you're going to change the kind of service that the entire customer base from that utility gets. So it's worth investing in strengthening a utility. And then finally, what can we learn from the sanitation sector? And I think the thing that the sanitation sector has done that has been so different from rural water supply is that there's been a huge focus on demand. Get people revved up, get people to demand something. There's been a huge reliance on markets to provide the services. The whole premise of things like community-led total sanitation is people will build their own toilets and they will turn to the markets for services. They'll turn to markets to get masons to come and build toilets for them. They'll turn to markets to buy sanitation components. And then they will also turn to the market when it's time to sustain those toilets. So they will look for private pit emptying companies, septic tank desludgers, or masons to come and rebuild their toilets for them. And the most fundamental thing here is changing the status quo. The discourse in sanitation is all about change. It's about empowerment. In some ways, it's almost as if it didn't matter that it was sanitation. Certainly within UNICEF, we're looking at what's happening in sanitation and thinking about how we can use the same kind of models to change the way people demand health services, whether or not they take their children to be vaccinated, whether or not they breastfeed, to change social norms and to change the way communities think about themselves, and to empower empower people to actually demand change. And I think that that's something that we definitely haven't done enough in rural water supply and sanitation services. We have to change people from passive recipients of services of whatever pump or water system has been determined for them into bodies that actually demand change. So what can we do as we limp towards sustainability? And here I'm going to offer up a few sort of final ideas on solutions. I think we should continue efforts to improve utility management to ensure sustainability of piped water systems. And that way, those two big dark blue, light blue bits, we will ensure sustainability there. But we urgently need to develop better systems for rural point source sustainability, using demand and collective action, capacitating local government, and this is where the key really lies. Is all of this leads you to believe, leads me believe anyway, that the real focus of our attention should be on local government. Communities are too small to maintain some of these systems. The next level up has to be local government, and that's where the accountability has to lie, and that's where people should be demanding services from. But I don't actually mean that local governments should necessarily become providers of all of those services, because I think one of the things we need to do is to make communities clients of sustainability services, not providers. So instead of having to run a supply chain for spare parts themselves, they should be clients of an organization which perhaps has been contracted by their local government to do what a private operator or whatever can do best, which is to make sure that those systems keep running. We should ensure the strategic use of the private sector, and particularly here I think that new innovation in the sector opens up doorways for this. I'm constantly asked why we don't do more with SMS messaging for reporting pump failures, for instance. Now that only works if you've actually got a system that will respond to the SMS message. The SMS message is not the solution. But why don't we look at how we could use things like that kind of electronic media to be able to set up performance frameworks for those providers of these sustainability services? And aggregate sustainability service needs in order to get that scale, so that we do the same thing that we do when we strengthen an urban utility, which is we strengthen one institution, and that has a huge impact on a large number of people, instead of having to work community by community. We've got to bring these communities together. Perhaps we've even got to group groups of local governments together in order to be able to do this. And make sustainability part of strategic sector planning, coming back to my point that too much of rural water supply is off budget, off plan, off policy. We need to help governments include sustainability and include some of these mechanisms when they're actually planning for the sector. And too few governments don't even plan for the sector. So first, we've got to really work on improving the way we do robust sector planning. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments.